You should know your place before you speak to people like me. Richard Sterling's voice cracked through the crowded school hallway so sharply that every nearby conversation died in an instant. The polished marble floor reflected the morning sunlight pouring through the glass entrance, as dozens of parents slowly turned to stare. Evelyn Brooks stood motionless beside classroom 214, a stack of essays pressed gently against her chest. Her faded navy blazer had been carefully ironed, but the cuffs showed years of wear. Around her neck hung a simple silver necklace, the only thing she had never pawned. Richard took one slow step closer, the expensive leather of his shoes clicking against the floor with measured confidence. The scent of his cologne drifted through the tense silence. You teach children from families like mine? He asked with a cold smile that never reached his eyes. That is the funniest thing I have heard all year. A few parents exchanged nervous glances. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended her either. Evelyn lifted her chin only slightly. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, steady but heavy. She could feel dozens of eyes studying every tiny movement she made. Good morning, Mr. Sterling, she said quietly. Your son has made remarkable progress this semester. Richard's smile disappeared. Do not talk to me about progress. My donations built half this school. I decide what progress looks like. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while an air conditioner pushed cool air through the corridor, yet the hallway suddenly felt suffocating. Principal Linda Carter hurried toward them, her heels striking the tile with quick, anxious steps. Mr. Sterling, she said carefully, forcing a smile, perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. Richard never looked away from Evelyn. No. I want everyone to hear this. His voice grew louder. Children preparing for Ivy League universities deserve teachers with real prestige, not. His eyes traveled slowly over Evelyn's modest clothes before returning to her face. Someone who clearly settled for less. A low murmur spread through the hallway. Evelyn tightened her grip on the papers until the edges bent beneath her fingers. She had heard comments like these before. Different schools. Different cities. Different people. Always the same look. Always the same assumption. Behind Richard, a teenage boy stood frozen near the trophy case. Ethan Sterling had arrived early for senior rehearsal, still wearing his graduation jacket over his shoulder. His eyes shifted uneasily between his father and his English teacher. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, then lowered his gaze instead. Richard noticed the movement. Ethan, he called without turning around. Tell your teacher what university accepted you. Ethan swallowed. Harvard. Richard nodded proudly. Exactly. Success recognizes success. Evelyn looked at Ethan for only a second. She noticed the exhaustion beneath his eyes, the sleepless shadows he had tried to hide, and the folded piece of paper sticking halfway out of his notebook. She recognized the handwriting immediately because she had helped him rewrite that speech 5 different times after school, while everyone else had already gone home. Richard had no idea. Congratulations, Evelyn said softly. Ethan looked at her with an expression Richard completely missed. It was not pride. It was guilt. The bell suddenly rang, vibrating through the building like the opening note of a storm. Students flooded into the hallway, sneakers squeaking across polished floors, lockers slamming shut, backpacks brushing against shoulders. Richard stepped aside with complete confidence, convinced the moment belonged to him. Then Principal Carter's phone vibrated. She glanced down at the screen. The color drained from her face. She looked first at Richard, then at Evelyn, before whispering words that neither of them had expected to hear. The graduation committee just made a decision, and everything is about to change. Principal Linda Carter lowered the phone slowly, her fingers trembling just enough for Evelyn to notice. The hallway had fallen strangely quiet despite hundreds of students moving past. Graduation banners swayed gently above the lockers as sunlight spilled across the polished floor. Richard Sterling folded his arms. Well? He demanded. Linda drew a careful breath. The graduation committee has unanimously selected this year's commencement speaker. Richard's confident smile returned. Excellent. I assume they finally made the obvious decision. His eyes shifted proudly toward Ethan. Several parents nodded, already expecting the billionaire's son to receive another honor. But Linda looked past Richard and met Evelyn's eyes instead. The faculty voted for the teacher who changed the senior class the most. Richard's smile froze. Evelyn blinked. There must be some mistake, Richard said, his voice noticeably sharper. Linda shook her head. There is no mistake. A ripple of whispers spread through the hallway. Students slowed their steps. One by one, they began gathering outside classroom 214. Ethan stared at the floor, his jaw tightening. Richard turned toward him. You knew about this? Ethan hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. Richard's expression hardened. Answer me. I heard rumors, Ethan admitted quietly. Richard exhaled through clenched teeth. Rumors are for children. Evelyn remained still, the essays still pressed against her chest. She had never asked for recognition. She had only asked her students to tell the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Linda reached into a folder and carefully removed a cream-colored envelope sealed with the school crest. Mrs. Brooks, she said softly, the committee also requested that your speech remain completely confidential until graduation. Richard stepped forward before Evelyn could respond. I sit on the district advisory board, he said coldly. I have every right to review that speech. Linda did not hand him the envelope. Respectfully, you do not. The air felt suddenly heavier. Somewhere down the hall, a maintenance cart rolled across the tile, its wheels rattling before disappearing around a corner. The ordinary sound only made the silence between them feel louder. Richard's eyes narrowed. You are making a serious mistake. No, Linda answered calmly. We are following the student's decision. Richard laughed once, short and humorless. Students do not understand influence. Before anyone could answer, a voice rose from the crowd. She changed my life. Every head turned. A young woman wearing a navy graduation gown stepped forward from the gathering seniors. Mine too, another student said. Then another. Within seconds, more voices joined in until the hallway echoed with quiet declarations instead of applause. None of them sounded rehearsed. None of them looked at Richard. They looked only at Evelyn. Richard glanced around, visibly unsettled for the first time that morning. He had spent years buying buildings, scholarships, and headlines. Yet he could not purchase the gratitude filling that hallway. Ethan slowly reached into his backpack and removed the folded pages Evelyn had helped him rewrite over countless afternoons. His hands were damp, the paper slightly wrinkled along the edges. Richard noticed immediately. What is that? He asked. Ethan looked at his father, then at Evelyn. His voice was barely above a whisper. It is not the speech you think I am giving on graduation day. Richard's heartbeat seemed to stop. What did you just say? Ethan unfolded the pages, revealing the first line at the top. Richard caught only 5 words before the paper slipped back into Ethan's hands. They were enough to drain every trace of confidence from his face. The truth about my teacher. Richard Sterling stared at the folded pages in Ethan's hands as though they contained a language he no longer understood. The hallway seemed to narrow around him. Sunlight flashed across the trophy cases, reflecting off polished brass plaques while dozens of silent phones slowly rose into the air. No one was recording Evelyn. Every lens was pointed at Richard. Give me the paper, he said, extending his hand with practiced authority. Ethan did not move. The hesitation lasted only a heartbeat, yet it was enough for everyone to notice. Richard had spent a lifetime closing deals before anyone dared question him. His own son had never ignored an order. Until now. Evelyn quietly stepped aside, creating space instead of stepping into the confrontation. Her calm only made the tension sharper. Linda Carter watched both of them carefully, her hands clasped tightly around the sealed envelope. This conversation ends here, she said. Richard barely acknowledged her. You filled his head with this, he said, turning toward Evelyn. His voice remained controlled, but the strain underneath was impossible to hide. You convinced him to embarrass his own family. Evelyn met his eyes without raising her voice. I never taught your son how to embarrass anyone. I only taught him to write what he could defend with the truth. The words landed with surprising weight. A quiet murmur drifted through the crowd. Ethan looked down at the pages, then back at his father. She tried to stop me from writing about you, he admitted. Richard blinked. What? She told me graduation should celebrate hope, not revenge. For the first time that morning, Richard looked genuinely confused. He had expected manipulation. He had expected resentment. He had not expected restraint. Evelyn folded her hands in front of her. Your son deserves to tell his own story, she said. Not mine. A long silence settled between them. The ventilation system hummed overhead. Somewhere outside, a school bus released its brakes with a soft burst of air before pulling away. Ordinary sounds continued while everything inside the hallway felt suspended. Richard reached toward Ethan again. Then let me read it. Ethan slowly shook his head. No. The single word echoed harder than anyone expected. Richard's shoulders stiffened. You are 17 years old. 18, Ethan answered quietly. As of yesterday. Another surprise crossed Richard's face. He had forgotten his son's birthday. The realization lasted only an instant, but several parents exchanged uneasy glances. Evelyn noticed it too. She looked away, giving Richard the dignity of not witnessing his embarrassment. That small act unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Before anyone spoke again, Linda's phone vibrated once more. She glanced at the screen, then immediately looked toward the front entrance. Her expression changed from concern to disbelief. Through the glass doors, a black sedan rolled slowly to the curb. The district superintendent stepped out first. Behind her came 3 members of the school board carrying leather portfolios. They were not scheduled to visit until graduation. Students instinctively moved aside as the group entered the building. The superintendent scanned the crowded hallway before locking eyes with Evelyn. Then she smiled. Mrs. Brooks, she called loud enough for everyone to hear. We have been looking for you. There is something the entire school deserves to know before graduation. Richard felt the confidence drain from his face as every head in the hallway turned away from him and toward the woman he had tried so hard to diminish. The superintendent stepped into the hallway with measured confidence, the polished metal clasp of her portfolio catching the cold morning light. The quiet murmur among students faded until only the faint buzz of fluorescent lights remained. Richard Sterling straightened his jacket, forcing composure back onto his face. I hope this interruption is worth delaying the school day, he said. The superintendent did not answer him. She stopped directly in front of Evelyn Brooks instead. Mrs. Brooks, she said warmly, thank you for staying. Confused whispers rippled through the crowd. Richard frowned. What exactly is going on? Linda Carter handed over the cream-colored envelope. The superintendent accepted it without opening it. For the past 6 months, she began, our district has conducted an anonymous review of classrooms across the county. We observed teaching methods, student growth, graduation readiness, and long-term academic outcomes. Richard folded his arms. And? The highest-performing classroom in the district belonged to Mrs. Brooks. Silence settled over the hallway. Several students exchanged stunned looks. Richard gave a short laugh. There are dozens of schools with better funding than this one. Exactly, the superintendent replied. That is why the results surprised everyone. She removed a slim report from her portfolio. Charts, attendance records, college acceptance data, and handwritten student testimonials filled the pages. Students entering Mrs. Brooks's classroom improved more than any other graduating class we evaluated. Many arrived behind grade level. Nearly every one of them graduated prepared for college. Richard's jaw tightened. Numbers can be manipulated. Evelyn remained still. She did not reach for the report. She did not defend herself. The superintendent looked directly at Richard. That possibility was investigated. A school board member stepped forward and placed another folder on a nearby table. Independent auditors confirmed every figure. More phones quietly lifted into the air as students recorded the unfolding moment. Richard noticed them and lowered his voice. This recognition does not erase professional standards. No, Evelyn answered calmly. It does not. Everyone turned toward her. Professional standards are exactly why I refused every request to change grades that students did not earn. Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Careful, he warned. I am always careful, Evelyn replied. There was no anger in her voice, only quiet certainty. Ethan stared at the floor, his breathing growing heavier. The folded speech remained in his hands. He looked as though he wanted to speak, yet every word stayed trapped behind his lips. The superintendent glanced toward him before returning her attention to Richard. Your son submitted an essay during our statewide writing assessment. Richard nodded confidently. He has always been an excellent writer. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. Actually, he whispered. Richard turned immediately. Actually what? Ethan looked at Evelyn first. She offered only the slightest nod, giving him permission to speak or remain silent. The decision was entirely his. He swallowed. The essay that earned statewide recognition. His voice trembled. It almost never happened. The hallway grew impossibly still. Even the students recording lowered their phones a fraction. Richard stared at his son, suddenly uncertain. Ethan slowly unfolded another sheet of paper from inside his notebook. It was worn along the edges, covered in red ink and careful handwritten notes. At the top, in Evelyn Brooks's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 simple words. Tell the truth, even here. Richard recognized the paper immediately. It was not a graded assignment. It was the draft he had personally ordered Ethan to throw away. Richard Sterling stared at the marked-up essay in Ethan's hands as though it had become evidence in a courtroom. The red ink across the page caught the morning light, every handwritten note standing out against the white paper. The hallway remained silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system and the distant squeak of sneakers on polished floors. Richard took one deliberate step forward. Give it to me. Ethan's fingers tightened around the pages instead. His palms were damp, leaving faint marks along the edges. No, he answered quietly. The word barely rose above a whisper, yet it echoed through the crowded corridor. Parents exchanged uncertain glances. Students lowered their voices. Even the school board members watched without interrupting. Richard drew a slow breath, forcing calm back into his expression. You are making a mistake you will regret. Ethan shook his head. That is exactly what she told me not to do. Richard looked sharply toward Evelyn. You coached him. Evelyn remained composed, her hands folded in front of her. I challenged him, she replied. There is a difference. Richard laughed once, but there was no confidence behind it now. You expect everyone here to believe that? Before Evelyn could answer, Linda Carter carefully lifted another folder from the superintendent's portfolio. These are the original drafts from the statewide writing competition, she said. Every revision is documented. She opened the file on a nearby table. Several pages revealed Ethan's early essays, each covered with Evelyn's careful notes. There were no rewritten paragraphs, no prepared answers, only questions written in the margins. Why do you believe this? Can you support this claim? Tell the truth, even if it is uncomfortable. Richard leaned closer, scanning the pages. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She never wrote it for you? He asked, looking at Ethan. Ethan met his father's eyes for the first time that morning. She refused. Confusion spread through the crowd. Richard frowned. Refused? Ethan nodded. I asked her more than once to tell me what would impress Harvard. She said the admissions office already knew how to recognize polished lies. She told me they wanted to meet the real person. A quiet murmur passed through the students. Several seniors smiled faintly, recognizing the same advice they had received. Richard looked from one face to another and realized they were not reacting with surprise. They already knew who Evelyn was. He was the only person who had never taken the time to find out. The superintendent closed the folder. Mrs. Brooks has quietly mentored students for years without accepting additional pay. Nearly every scholarship winner standing in this hallway sought her help. Richard's shoulders stiffened. If she is so extraordinary, why is she still teaching here? Evelyn answered before anyone else could. Because some students need someone who stays. Her voice remained gentle, almost understated, but the words settled heavily over the hallway. Ethan lowered his eyes. She stayed after school with me for 4 months, he admitted. Even on Fridays. Even when everyone else had gone home. Richard blinked. You told me you were meeting with a private admissions consultant. Ethan hesitated. I lied. The confession struck harder than anyone expected. Richard stepped back as though the floor itself had shifted beneath him. For a long moment, neither father nor son spoke. Then the superintendent reached into her portfolio one final time and removed a sealed envelope bearing the crest of the National Teacher of the Year Foundation. She looked directly at Evelyn. Mrs. Brooks, she said softly, this arrived before any of us came here today. Evelyn frowned. I was not expecting anything. Neither were we. The superintendent carefully broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and silently read the first paragraph. The color slowly disappeared from her face. She looked up at Evelyn with astonishment, then toward the stunned crowd. There has been a development, she whispered. I do not think anyone in this building understands who Mrs. Brooks truly is. The superintendent lowered the letter with unusual care, as though even the paper itself carried unexpected weight. No one spoke. The hallway that had been filled with whispers only moments before now held nothing but the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the faint vibration of an air vent above the lockers. Every face turned toward Evelyn Brooks. She did not step forward. She did not ask what the letter said. Instead, she quietly gathered the stack of essays she had dropped during the morning's confrontation, smoothing each page with deliberate hands. The small gesture felt strangely powerful. Richard Sterling watched her with growing uncertainty. He had expected anger. He had expected triumph. He had expected someone eager to prove him wrong. What he saw instead was a teacher making sure no student's work was bent or damaged. The realization unsettled him more than another argument ever could. Ethan stood a few feet away, his graduation jacket hanging loosely from one hand. His breathing had slowed, but his eyes never left Evelyn. He remembered every afternoon she had stayed after school, every essay returned with patient notes instead of easy answers, every conversation that ended with the same quiet reminder. Earn your own voice. Linda Carter noticed the silence spreading through the crowd. Parents who had arrived expecting an ordinary school morning now stood shoulder to shoulder with seniors in graduation gowns, none of them looking at Richard anymore. Several phones remained raised, yet nobody seemed interested in recording. The moment had become too personal for applause or spectacle. Richard finally broke the silence. What does the letter say? His voice was calm, but the strain beneath it was unmistakable. The superintendent looked at him briefly before returning her attention to Evelyn. Mrs. Brooks, she said softly, did you truly never tell anyone? Evelyn frowned with genuine confusion. Tell them what? The superintendent hesitated. Even the school board members exchanged uncertain glances. One of them slowly removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose before nodding almost imperceptibly. She really does not know, he murmured. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. For the first time that morning, events were unfolding beyond his influence. He was no longer directing the conversation. He was trying to catch up with it. Evelyn looked from face to face, sensing that everyone else had suddenly learned something she had not. If this concerns my students, she said quietly, please tell me after graduation. They deserve today without distractions. Richard stared at her in disbelief. Even now, she was thinking about someone else. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, understanding why the room had changed. Respect had arrived without announcement. It had simply settled over the crowd. The superintendent folded the letter again, careful not to crease it. "There is one more matter," she said. "It cannot wait." She reached into her portfolio and removed a second envelope, thicker than the first, sealed with dark blue wax bearing a crest no one immediately recognized. Richard leaned forward instinctively. "What is that?" No one answered. The superintendent handed the unopened envelope directly to Evelyn. She accepted it with both hands, studying the unfamiliar seal. Around her, the hallway remained perfectly still. Even the distant sounds from the gymnasium seemed to fade. Evelyn slipped one finger beneath the seal and paused. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she recognized the emblem pressed into the wax. The color slowly left her face. She whispered a single sentence that no one expected to hear. "This should not exist." The blue wax seal cracked with a soft snap that seemed impossibly loud inside the silent hallway. Evelyn unfolded the letter carefully, her eyes moving across the page once, then stopping. She did not smile. She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though recognizing a voice from another lifetime. Richard Sterling searched her face for triumph, but found only quiet disbelief. "What is it?" he asked, unable to hide the tension in his voice. Evelyn looked toward the superintendent instead of answering. "I thought they had chosen someone else," she said softly. The superintendent gave a slow shake of her head. "They tried to reach you for weeks. Every letter was returned because you had changed apartments." A school board member stepped forward with another folder. "Mrs. Brooks, 2 years ago your students anonymously nominated you for the National Teacher of the Year award. Their essays advanced through every stage of review." Confused whispers spread across the crowd. Evelyn blinked. "My students?" "Every one of them," the superintendent replied. "Not one nomination came from a principal, a district official, or a parent. They all came from the young people whose lives you changed." Ethan lowered his head, his voice barely audible. "I wrote one." Another senior raised her hand. "So did I." Within seconds, more students quietly admitted the same. Richard slowly turned, realizing that nearly every graduating senior standing in the hallway had been part of something he had never noticed. None of them had been asked. None of them had been rewarded. They had simply wanted their teacher to be seen. The superintendent continued, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "The review committee visited this school 3 separate times under different identities. They observed classrooms, interviewed graduates, and reviewed years of student work." Richard frowned. "Without telling anyone?" "That was the point," one board member answered. "Recognition means very little if it appears only when cameras are present." Evelyn lowered her eyes to the letter again. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note from the Foundation's chairperson. "Thank you for choosing students over recognition." Richard felt the words settle heavily inside him. He remembered every assumption he had made that morning. He had measured influence by wealth, prestige, and visibility. Evelyn had measured it by lives quietly changed after the final bell rang. Ethan stepped closer to his teacher. "You always told us that the best work is the work nobody applauds." Evelyn smiled gently. "Because the students are supposed to become the story." Richard drew a slow breath, but the confidence that had once defined every movement was gone. Around him, parents who had stood silently during his public criticism now looked at Evelyn with unmistakable respect. Several lowered their phones altogether. The moment no longer belonged on a screen. It belonged to the people who had lived it. Richard took one hesitant step forward. "Mrs. Brooks?" The words caught in his throat. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, yet a simple apology suddenly felt impossibly difficult. Before he could continue, Linda Carter glanced toward the front entrance. A black town car had just pulled to the curb. An elderly woman stepped out carrying a single leather-bound scrapbook against her chest. She paused before entering, looking through the glass doors until her eyes found Evelyn. Tears immediately filled her face. She whispered one sentence that only those nearest the entrance could hear. "She still does not know what she gave my son." Evelyn looked up, confused, as the woman began walking toward her, holding the worn scrapbook as though it contained a truth that would change everything once again. The elderly woman stopped a few feet in front of Evelyn, holding the worn scrapbook against her heart as though it contained something too precious to trust to trembling hands. The hallway remained silent. The morning light reflected softly across the glass trophy cases, casting pale ribbons of light over faces that only minutes earlier had been filled with certainty. Now they carried something else entirely. Curiosity. Humility. Regret. Evelyn searched the woman's face but could not place it. "I am sorry," she said gently. "Have we met?" The woman smiled through tears. "You met my son." She opened the scrapbook carefully. Inside were photographs of a shy teenage boy sitting alone in the back row of an English classroom, pages of essays covered with familiar red handwriting, and a graduation program with Evelyn's signature in one corner. "His name was Daniel Mercer," the woman whispered. Evelyn's eyes softened. She remembered him immediately. The quiet student who almost never volunteered, who stayed after class pretending to organize his backpack because he was afraid to go home. "Daniel," Evelyn repeated softly. "He loved history." The woman nodded. "He also believed he was not smart enough for college until you refused to let him give up." Richard Sterling watched without speaking. His shoulders, once perfectly squared, now seemed strangely heavy. The woman turned another page. A photograph showed Daniel wearing a white medical coat, smiling beside a children's hospital sign. "He became a pediatric surgeon," she said. "He told everyone it happened because one teacher believed in him before he believed in himself." Several parents lowered their eyes. Ethan quietly wiped at one corner of his eye before anyone noticed. The woman took a folded letter from between the scrapbook pages and handed it to Evelyn. "Daniel wrote this before he passed away last year." Evelyn's breath caught. She unfolded the letter with careful hands. The paper had softened with age, its edges worn from being read again and again. She recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. "Dear Mrs. Brooks, if you ever wonder whether staying late after school mattered, please remember that every child I help someday carries a small piece of your kindness. You taught me that success begins when someone chooses not to give up on you. Thank you for seeing me when nobody else did." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, pressing the letter gently against her chest. She did not cry. She simply stood very still, allowing the words to settle into the quiet around her. Richard lowered his gaze. The hallway that had once witnessed public humiliation was now witnessing something entirely different. Respect that no title, donation, or influence could purchase. After a long silence, Richard stepped forward. His voice was lower than anyone had ever heard it. "Mrs. Brooks, I judged you before I knew you." Evelyn looked at him calmly. There was no anger in her expression. Only compassion touched by exhaustion. "You judged what you thought you saw," she answered. "Many people do." Richard nodded slowly. "That does not excuse it." For several seconds neither of them moved. Then Richard extended his hand, not as a billionaire, not as a board member, but simply as one person acknowledging another. Evelyn looked at the offered hand before accepting it with quiet grace. Around them, no one applauded. The silence itself carried more meaning than applause ever could. Yet as their hands separated, Ethan noticed something resting inside the scrapbook that neither of them had seen. Tucked into the final page was an unopened envelope addressed in Daniel's handwriting. Across the front, in careful blue ink, were 7 words that made Evelyn's heart stop for just a moment. "Please open this after graduation day." Graduation day arrived beneath a clear spring sky, and the auditorium glowed with warm morning light spilling through tall windows. The polished handrails reflected a soft, golden shimmer as families filled every seat, their conversations fading into quiet expectation. Students waited in neat rows behind the stage, smoothing their gowns, adjusting their caps, breathing a little deeper than usual. Evelyn Brooks stood near the side entrance with the unopened envelope still tucked carefully inside her bag. She had not opened it. Not yet. Daniel had asked her to wait until after graduation, and she intended to honor that promise. Richard Sterling entered the auditorium without the confidence that had once announced his arrival. The familiar sound of expensive dress shoes crossing the hardwood floor no longer carried authority. It carried reflection. When he noticed Evelyn across the room, he walked toward her slowly and stopped a respectful distance away. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks," he said. There was no audience in his voice now. Only sincerity. Evelyn smiled gently. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling." He hesitated before speaking again. "Thank you for refusing to become the person I believed you were." Evelyn looked toward the students gathering behind the curtain. "People usually become who someone believes they can be," she answered quietly. "That is why teachers must choose carefully." Richard lowered his eyes, understanding the weight of those words more deeply than any public apology could express. Moments later, the ceremony began. The principal welcomed the families, the school orchestra played the opening piece, and one by one the graduates crossed the stage beneath warm applause. Then Ethan Sterling approached the podium. He unfolded his speech, looked across the crowded auditorium, and paused. Every face waited. He took one slow breath. "Today," he began, "people will congratulate us for our grades, our scholarships, and our future careers. But there is someone who spent years helping us become the people standing here." His eyes found Evelyn in the front row. "Mrs. Brooks never taught us what to think. She taught us to have the courage to tell the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable." The auditorium remained perfectly still. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Ethan continued. "Success is not measured by the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it looks like a teacher staying after school because one student still believes they are not enough." He folded the speech, stepped away from the microphone, and walked directly to Evelyn. Without a word, he handed her the small ribbon that had been pinned inside his graduation gown. "You earned this long before I did," he said softly. Tears shimmered in the eyes of parents throughout the room. Richard rose to his feet first. Then the superintendent. Then the school board. Soon the entire auditorium stood together, not in celebration of wealth or influence, but in quiet recognition of a life spent lifting others. Evelyn did not bow her head. She simply placed one hand over her heart, humbled by the students she had always believed were her greatest achievement. After the ceremony ended and the auditorium slowly emptied, she finally opened Daniel's letter beneath the gentle light outside the school entrance. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. "If they ever stand for you the way you always stood for us, you will know your work was enough." Evelyn folded the letter with a peaceful smile and looked across the campus as graduates embraced their families beneath the bright afternoon sky. Richard watched from a distance before turning to leave, no longer carrying the certainty that money defined greatness. Behind him, the school doors closed softly. Ahead of Evelyn, another group of students was already walking toward the building for summer orientation. She straightened the stack of essays in her arms, smiled, and held the door open for the very first student. In the quiet reflection of the glass, no one saw a woman who had won. They saw a teacher who had never stopped showing up.